Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Al Waterman, it is a true pleasure to be able to have you on the podcast today. Welcome to Meaningful Work Matters. You're, I guess, a little bit of a hero of mine. I have to start by saying that, as somebody who has spent a lot of my life thinking about the idea of eudaimonia, you are one of the few people who truly has spent their career thinking about, wrestling with, exploring this idea of eudaimonia from a psychological perspective. And your ideas have really influenced the way that I think about the ideas of self-realization and potentiation and everything that eudaimonia might be able to do for us. So it's a pleasure to be able to have this opportunity to actually spend some time talking with you and getting to hear it from your mouth directly.
Glad to provide it.
Al, maybe you can just start by introducing yourself the way that you'd like our audience to hear you, and also just share a little bit about what makes your work meaningful.
Well, my background is psychology, specifically my training in clinical psychology. The reason for that was not because I had planned to become a practicing clinician, but clinical psych was the way to try to understand the whole person functioning in an integrated fashion. I think there was pretty much from the start a concern on my part for what makes for a life worth living. This is a theme that's not only central to positive psychology, but has its roots in philosophy as well. And I've had a long-standing interest in reading philosophy as well as psychology. I mean, I go back to my graduate work was in the 1960s. And this was at a time when personality theories really were at the fore. And a very common theme in the works of writers like Karen Horney and Maslow was the sense of what makes for living successfully. The real origins of positive psychology can be traced back that far. And so when I started doing research as well as teaching, it was with an eye to what kinds of decisions can people make in their lives that are likely to promote a sense of their feeling that they are successful and doing what they would choose to do.
It's so helpful for you to just start with some of that context. I think that those of us who are schooled in positive psychology, which many of the people listening to this podcast probably are, we often think of this field as starting, in the 2000-ish period of time when, Martin Seligman stands on the stage of the APA and declares this is the origin of a new field, or, seminal articles by Csikszentmihalyi and Seligman. And just your articulation of the fact that no, there were people who were talking about this, within psychology all throughout the 20th century, but certainly philosophically for thousands of years.
Exactly.
Is a really important starting point.
The concept of eudaimonia obviously goes back to the Greeks and to Aristotle. One of my favorite ways of introducing the concept of eudaimonia is with an adaptation of a quote from contemporary eudaimonist philosopher David Norton. It goes something like, being where one wants to be, doing what one wants to do, where what you are doing is something that is worth doing and is worth doing to the best of your ability.
That's a beautiful articulation. Would you say that's your best definition of eudaimonia, or would you expand it from there?
Going back to Aristotle, the term itself is typically translated as happiness, but he did not mean it as a subjective term, and certainly not as pleasure. It actually makes a very strong contrast that a life of pleasure is essentially not worth living, because the phrasing for it was, it's a life for grazing animals. So it was an objective standard that he was proposing, and typically the term virtue is used in that context. But the meaning of virtue is much broader than the simply ethical behavior. There's a sense of fulfilling nature fulfillment that goes with that, of being the very best that one can be within the context. Now, his concern there was with human nature. And so what was the fulfillment of the best of human nature? And he talks about contemplation and reasoning and the kinds of things that we as are able to do that animals and not other animals are not able to do. And so he was concerned with what I would refer to as a species generic sense of what the potentials that we have. And it was David Norton, who I think had considerable influence on my thinking, who was talking about not only species generic potentials and their fulfillment, but the fulfillment of our individual specific potentials as well. Each of us has those things that we have the capacity, the capability, the potential to do that are better than all of the other things that are equally available for us to do. And so we move then from a sense of fulfillment of our species nature to self-realization, self-fulfillment, self-actualization.
I'd love to just pause on this idea because I think that it's so fundamental, certainly to an Aristotelian perspective on what eudaimonia is, but also its implications to today. This idea that as a species, we are trying to fulfill the potential of the species of humanity, and that as an individual, our goal is to fulfill our own unique potential. And that Aristotle was talking about this from a place that, at least from his vantage point and perspective, would have been in objective terms, that there actually could be an articulation of what that potential could be. What did he
Yeah.
think that could be? Like, what did he think the species potential was?
I think one needs to make some corrections to
Right.
Aristotle on species potential, because his concerns were only with men, not with women, excluded children and adolescents from experience
That's right.
eudaimonia. I don't know how far back I'm willing to go to say that children experience eudaimonia, but the first instance of it, which it is clearly observable, is a child taking their first steps. In fact, what they are doing is beginning to fulfill one of their species generic sets of potentials, in this particular instance, locomotion. And not that they weren't doing, the creeping and the crawling before that, but this is a major advance, and they recognize it even at that age, that it is a genuine accomplishment in the development of their skills and in terms of what they are able to do. And the delight is just so amazing to observe.
So we have this idea of self-potentiation, what we're capable of
Yeah.
being and doing, and maybe even feeling as
Yeah.
as humans. Is it true that eudaimonia can be thought of in a thinking, feeling, and doing kind of a way?
One of the things that, as a psychologist reading philosophy, it's on eudaimonia, it was, I want to say, obvious to me that if we are functioning in a way that is helping us, that where we are recognizing our potentials and we are making strides toward their development, which isn't easy, that we are aware of that we recognize that what we are doing, so that there is a subjective quality to eudaimonia as well as an objective quality. I don't want the subjective aspects of eudaimonia. And when I first introduced started writing about it in psychology, I did not think the term eudaimonia was going to resonate well. And boy, was I surprised on that. But my early reference to it, and always in conjunction, was feelings of personal expressiveness. We recognize when we are doing something that we have a connection with, that is representing, identifying our potentials and then developing them, so that there is that recognition. What's most important is the potentials themselves and the progress we are making to them. But the subjective elements are extremely helpful in the process, because they are providing us with the information as to whether or not we are having success in that regard. So the subjective aspect is instrumental, but a life worth living is based upon, objectively, our ability to identify and develop and express the potentials that represent our greatest strengths and contributions that we are making, not just to ourselves, but our greatest strengths are contributions to others as well.
Sometimes people talk about the relationship between feeling good and doing good. Even just
Mhm.
going back to your example of the child taking the first steps and starting to walk, that joy that
Yeah.
comes from seeing a child
Yeah.
recognize what they are doing,
Yeah.
is that subjective feeling that is so key to being able to realize our potential.
I sometimes have been asked, why do I use the term self-realization rather than self-actualization? Part of the answer to that is that, unfortunately, some of Maslow's contributions got sidetracked, because there was a sense that peak experiences were the objective, that if you were having peak experiences, that's what mattered. When you look at who Maslow chose as his exemplars of self actualization, the dedication and the work and the productivity of those people is one of the things that really stands out. That they were also peakers, not all of them, but most of them peakers. Again, in that instance, confirmation that what they were doing was something worth doing and worth doing well.
Okay, we've been talking in this wonderful theoretical way
Yeah.
about eudaimonia. Let's ground this in the domain of work. How does any of
Okay.
this, do you think, relate to the topic of work?
I want to start there with making the distinction between work as a calling and work as a job. For work as a calling, there is that sense of eudaimonia almost built into it. The kinds of things that one feels called to do are things that are experienced as intrinsically motivating, that people want to do because they consider them worth doing. And that means that virtually by definition, they are going to invest themselves very heavily in it. There's a tendency to view work as a calling as something that is the exception and fairly uncommon. And I want to say it's far more common, I think, than people think. You not only see it in the creative arts and the performing arts, and you see it in athletics, you see it in scientists, you see it in professions like medicine and teaching, but you also see it in first responders. And you see it for people who feel a connection to the natural world. I sometimes think if I hadn't discovered psychology, I would have been a park ranger. Not that I did not feel intrinsically motivated in that direction. I was. My original field before psychology was in biology. But what if I had never discovered psychology? A distinct possibility. we have multiple areas in our lives where we feel that sense of connection. And that sense of connection is the origin point for the feelings of being called to engage in some activities. And that's not just applying to work, but also often we feel called to our serious leisure. We feel called with respect to our personal relationships. That sense of calling can be extremely broad, not an esoteric concept, not a rare concept, but I think very widely experienced. The work as a job is almost by definition to involving extrinsic motivations rather than intrinsic motivations. When work is a job, the what you are doing often is more a matter of convenience of what's available at the time or who you may have a connection with. Historically, this would go back to the 1950s, that you have factory towns, and if your father worked at a plant, it was very likely that you would have an opportunity to work at the same plant, not because one felt any particular affinity to the work that was being done, but because that was what was readily available for you to do. And so there's a path of least resistance in finding work rather than the kind of dedicated effort that is involved in pursuing work as a calling.
This is probably a good moment to tell listeners, if you're interested in this distinction between job as a calling versus job as a career. The first place I would point you to in this podcast is a wonderful conversation I had with Jeff Thompson, who's perhaps
Mhm.
one of my favorite folks who kind of focuses on calling, and also Michael Pratt. It's a wonderful, expansive framework of the kind of what is sometimes described as work orientation theory, which is where some of this job and calling
Mhm.
conversation comes. And he would also say that there's lots of good, very utilitarian reasons why people work, which is kind of, I think, his alternative to the idea of a job, let alone
Mhm.
status, which is
Yeah.
kind of what many people describe as the careerist version of
Mhm.
work
Yeah.
orientation. I think that it's helpful for us to do a little bit of a double click on the relationship between eudaimonia and motivation.
Mm.
Can you just say a little bit more about the relationship between intrinsic motivation and self-realization?
The starting point, I think, is the concept of the individual's specific potentials. There is a sense of the need to identify what it is that one is able to do better than all of the other things that are equally available for us to do. We usually think of potentials in terms of interpersonal comparisons, how I compared to somebody else with respect to any given trait or skill that I might try to engage in. From a eudaimonic perspective, it's not the interpersonal comparisons that are important. It's the intrapersonal comparisons. What am I capable of doing more successfully, more expressively than other things that are equally available for me to do, and that we need to recognize what those potentials that we have that are likely to be that we are likely to be able to express most successfully. If we put our efforts at trying to develop our skills, we are going to have more success than if we tried to develop skills for which we had less potentials. What we then need to do is to have some means of identifying what it is that are our best potentials. My earliest research was on identity formation, how we choose our goals, our values, our beliefs. And what interested me at the time was not just the process, but how could we distinguish our better options from those that are not we're not likely to be as successful. And I don't mean that just in terms of skill development. I mean that in terms of our goals, our values, our beliefs even, are some things we resonate with And we want to find ways of expressing those values that resonate for us
Mm,
rather than try to fulfill somebody else's expectations for what our values should be. And so, in trying to answer that question of what represents our better identity choices, the conclusion that came fairly readily was intrinsic motivation. Those things that we feel that sense of connection with, where we want to engage in the activity, or we want to express the value, or we want to express the belief because we feel it is valuable in itself,
mm,
was the answer to the identity question. And so that led to a whole lot of focus on my part and with research colleagues like Seth Schwartz on studying intrinsic motivation and what makes things why do we have the intrinsic motivation to do things that we do? One of the most fascinating things about intrinsic motivation is its selectivity. That the very same activity that we find personally expressive, somebody else is entirely indifferent to, and even conceivably finds actively aversive. The work that I have been doing more extensively is what is it about the person
mm,
that contributes to the fit. And that goes back to the personal strengths, the potentialities of each individual. I respond to birding and not to rock climbing because of the particular potential skills that I've been able to develop. There's a cartoon that I love of two caterpillars talking to each other, looking at a butterfly, and one of them says to the other, "You'll never get me to go up in one of those things." When I talk about potentialities, so far I've been focusing primarily on skills, on
mhm,
the kinds of skills that one can develop. But it's also there's a grounding in our values as well. It is
mm.
perfectly plausible to be highly skilled at something and not to care about it. There are people who often will go into a career that they are very good at enacting, but which they don't really feel a connection to because it's not a high value thing. It's instrumental rather than personally expressive, instrumental rather than eudaimonic for them.
Yeah, this is amazing. There's a few things that I'll just try to put a spotlight on in what you just described because there's so much there that I think is really, really useful. The first place I want to start is just the idea of resonance,
Mhm.
which I think is a really powerful word, right? This
Yeah.
idea that there are certain things, just as in music, that feel resonant to us, and other things that feel dissonant to us, and that
Mhm.
part of what eudaimonia is about having the self awareness. So knowing thyself is also knowing what is going to work for you. This idea of you described it as person activity fit, which someone like
Yeah.
Sonia Lyubomirsky has spent a lot of
Yeah.
her career studying.
Yeah.
Is how do we really recognize that one size fits none for the whole
Mhm.
entire population?
And
That
yeah.
really what our aspiration is to understand what is the thing that is resonant for you, even if that thing that is resonance is in fact dissonance. How do we do that kind of work? And there's many ways, and that knowing thyself work
Yeah.
sounds a lot of it like
Yeah.
an exploration of, well, what are your strengths, and then even trying to have a broader perspective of, well, strengths can be many things. They can be interests and skills, they can be passions, but they can also be virtues and
Yeah.
character as well.
Mhm.
And so one of the questions that I just specifically have for you is, where does virtue fit into this story of resonant person activity fit?
I think it was a philosopher by the name of Pencoffs, I'm not positive of that, was saying that there is no master virtue. It is not as if there is one virtue that everything becomes traceable back to. My view of it has tended to be that the values that we have, the virtues that we have, vary from person to person, just as our skill potentials vary from person to person. And that being true to oneself is a function of recognizing which of the virtues is most important in one's personal life, and um, building the network of ethical decision making around that virtue. We're perfectly comfortable with the idea of different people having different skills. We're not as comfortable with the idea of different people having different virtues. All of the virtues are good and all of the vices are bad. Having different virtues seems unintelligible is too strong a word, but is as if they've got it wrong because they don't recognize the virtues that I think are most important.
I feel like if Aristotle was listening to this conversation, he would probably interject to say that that from his perspective, the mother of all virtue would be
Yeah.
phronesis, or the ability to understand what the right virtue in the right context, in the right situation with the right
It's
people is.
practical wisdom. Yes.
Practical wisdom,
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think that there's so much truth to that, is that
Yeah.
if you really take this extension
Yeah.
of resonance and dissonance and person
Yeah.
activity
Yeah.
fit and self-potentiation to its extreme, you have to recognize that
Yeah.
we are
Yeah.
constantly navigating,
Yeah.
this idea even of virtue as existing between two vices. You can
Mhm.
have too much of anything, and
Mhm.
therefore,
Mhm.
some of the
Yeah.
work is in self-realization,
Yeah.
is being able to know, hey, when do I take it too far?
One of the expressions that I have used fairly frequently is everything in moderation, including moderation. Passion is a productive emotion.
Completely. Passion can be a productive emotion. And of
Yeah.
course, as someone like Bob Balaran would say, passion can also become obsession too.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
how do we think about harmony and obsession in that context too, which
Yeah.
is many of the episodes of this podcast have been
Yeah.
trying to deal with that
Yeah.
specific issue in the topic of meaningful work.
One of the things that I have been thinking through recently has been the harmonious passions versus obsessive passions. And quite clearly, the harmonious passions are closest to eudaimonia. There is a sense of that one's life is being brought together in a way that one feels personally expressive for them, and if not conflict free, at least conflict minimized. With obsessive passions, you have considerable conflict. Harmonious passions is reflects intrinsic motivation. I'm coming to the conclusion that obsessive passions are not intrinsically motivating, that individuals are trying too hard to do what they feel they need to do or would wish to do, and also that it's a kind of doubling down on something that isn't working well. You can't stop doing it, the obsessive element in it, because you feel I absolutely, absolutely, absolutely have to get this right, and it isn't coming. It isn't
Mm.
working out the way in which you wish it to. And with regard to any development of any skill, you're going to reach a point where it plateaus. Some people are going to plateau at higher levels than others, and that's fine. If I'm plateauing at a skill or at a level where it is personally expressive for me, where hey, I wish I could go further, but hey, I like where I am, then it is a harmonious passion. It is intrinsically motivating, puts you in a place where it is a life well lived. If you are pushing and pushing and pushing, and particularly with all of the pushing, it isn't working. It is an obsessive passion, and it is not a place where people want to be.
I think that this is again a topic that within the context of this podcast we've spent a lot of time talking about, specifically people who are really engaged in things that they think are deeply meaningful. Going back to Jeff Thompson's example of the zookeepers, where there's a really high moral stake, and that work does become obsessively passionate. That it's impossible to remove yourself. You open yourself up to exploitation and alienation. You ultimately have greater career regret. you wind up being so invested in the work that you deteriorate other important relationships that are in your life that might be protective of your well-being, and you open yourself up to ultimately the conditions for burnout. What would you say to somebody who's trapped into that obsessively passionate loop?
First thing I think one needs to do is to step back and say, "Okay, of all of the things that are going on in your life now, what's working and what is not working?" Unfortunately, you may get the answer that nothing is working, but there is more promise in a situation where there is still a recognition that some of the things they are doing are more rewarding for them, more fulfilling for them than what they are obsessively engaged in. If you're interacting with someone who is, saying, there's nothing that is working in my life, next question to ask is this a place where you want to be? If you don't want to be there, what
Yeah.
is it going to take for you to be someplace else? Probably I would then go back to, can you think of a time when you had a better balance in your life, when there are things, not that everything was necessarily going well, but some things were going well in your life. And I think most people can do that. At that point, begin to have them focus more of their attention on whatever it is that they feel a sense of well-being in connection with. Another part of it is particularly people who are out to save the world, so to speak. Given the state you're in right now, how successful do you think you're going to be at doing that?
So, we're talking about somebody who is so intrinsically motivating they can't
Yeah.
actually separate themselves. What about the person who's not intrinsically motivated at all, who hasn't been able to know thyself enough to
Yeah.
find?
In part, that is something that, as a college professor, I have encountered more frequently than the instances of individuals who are burning themselves out. Because of too much passion for what they
Mhm.
are doing. What is needed is opportunities to identify, to find out what are those things that are likely to be intrinsically motivating in one's life? Ideally, this would have happened during the childhood and adolescent years, or even earlier in the college years, by exposure to a wide range of activities. One of the things I have been very supportive of is scouting, or activities for developing individuals that are focused on exposures to a wide variety of activities as one is likely to have encounter in an organized group fashion. I tell parents that one of the best things they can do with their children is to expose them to as wide a variety of activities as possible, knowing in advance that they will reject 99% of them. And that's fine. All it takes is one sense of connection with an activity to start one on a lifelong course toward the development of a calling, of a passion to do something. So it is that sense of exposure, and we see this also in counseling with adults. Counselors will give task assignments to clients. Try one new thing this week. Do something that you've never done before.
Mm.
It's with the same logic that all it takes is one activity that you feel that sense of connection to, and that first exposure to something you feel it can occur at any age. What you have to overcome with clients in counseling is anytime a counselor gives a suggestion, the two most frequent words that follow from the client are yes, but. You have to have the client buy in to the task and understand why they are being asked to try something that they've never done before.
One of my
Yeah.
favorite Chris Peterson interventions was the but-free day.
Mhm.
How do you try to eliminate but, shift
Mhm.
into a yes and instead of a yes but?
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that I'll just also connect here is one of the most recent episodes that we've just had is with Shige Oishi talking about a
Mm.
psychologically rich life, and
Mhm.
which he thought was
Yeah.
potentially a third dimension beyond eudaimonic and hedonic perspectives. There's
Mhm.
also this kind of richness, this sense of adventure that can be potentially different than self potentiation or
Yeah.
realization. It's certainly different than just a feeling of happiness. But to me, it seems like a wonderful connection point into how do we create experiences, especially in the workplace, that give us the opportunity to be serial generalists, that give us the
Mm.
opportunity to try different
Mm.
things.
I am not particularly concerned with individuals who have a singular focus. The question is it working for them? There are always opportunity costs that are associated in trying, multiple things, in taking multiple directions in life. Starting point is all of us have multiple potentials, things that we can find personally expressive and fulfilling, and for which we can develop skills. You know, if I were to try to have become both a park ranger and a psychologist, I would not have been able to invest myself as fully in the one that I did. The costs of that would clearly have outweighed the benefits that have come from having a singular career. On the other hand, married, 2 adult children who have their own families, tremendous rewards in the sense of relationship, would not have chosen to, forego those opportunities to devote more time to being a psychologist. There's always going to be a sense of trade-offs, and each individual has to make their own choices. Which potentials are sufficiently important that those are the ones that are going to be expressed. Others are going to be set aside, probably not necessarily, but probably for a lifetime. And those decisions are okay. I don't want to second guess other people making a decision not to be in a relationship or not to have children. Those are individual value choices. And if they are made on the grounds of pursuit of those things that those individuals find fulfilling in life, I want to say more power to them. I want to be an autonomy support, not a scold for why didn't you do this? If I want to live the life that I would choose, I feel the need to have other people the have the bandwidth, the freedom to make the decisions for the kinds of life that they would choose, as long as they are finding their life fulfilling and are doing so in ethically appropriate ways. This line is somebody else's, but I'll use it. Who am I to judge?
It's so helpful. It's so helpful, Al. The way that you've conceptualized all of this. I mean, I see so many different parallels into opportunities that we might be able to have in the workplace to be able to integrate
Mhm.
that kind of autonomy support, for example, in
Mm.
the way that you
Yeah.
just articulated, and in helping someone articulate and define their own
Yeah.
strengths to even build that self-awareness, of creating
Mhm.
opportunities where we can craft jobs and create contexts where people
Yeah.
can experiment and
Yeah.
lean into and try to be able to
Yeah.
apply those strengths in different
Yeah.
kinds of contexts
Mhm.
in ultimately helping to create the context where we can find more resonance in the workplace.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is undervalued by employers is their capacity to provide support for activities outside of the workplace.
Mm.
There are a lot of jobs that do not lend themselves to variety or intrinsic motivation. The jobs themselves, by their very nature, are routine. We should not expect that those jobs are going to be intrinsically motivating. but everybody has the potential for their particular strengths, their particular potentials, and those potentials may be expressed outside, whether in terms of serious leisure or in terms of relationships or in terms of religion and spirituality. What employers can do to the benefit not only of the employees, but also to the work environment is to be able to encourage and promote their employees finding and expressing and having the opportunities to express those intrinsically motivational activities outside of the workplace. You get a happier employee, a more productive employee, because they are essentially untroubled in their lives. They've got outside activities that are working for them. They've got a job that is supporting their opportunities outside, as well as presumably something that is non-toxic as a workplace. They have the best of both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation.
It's such a wise idea that we should think about ways in which we can, if you're responsible for a professional development plan,
Mhm.
think how do we change the professional to a personal development? What are the opportunities
Yeah.
outside of the workplace in
Mhm.
addition
Yeah.
to whatever might be happening to
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
cultivate
Yeah.
strength and virtue?
Yeah. Employers typically have a sense that their realm of operation is strictly within the workplace during work hours, and often I think they have the idea that employees don't want to have their employers interested in what they do outside, and I think that is actually more a function of whether or not one sees the employer, the supervisor, as a support figure or sees them as a controlling figure. Yes, there's always going to be a partial sense of control, but that isn't inconsistent with also being a support. And if an employee says back off, I respect that. But more often than not, if the employer, the supervisor, is coming forth and saying, "How can I help you? How can I support you in what you're trying to do?" Once the employee may overcome a certain degree of surprise, they will be very welcoming of it.
Well, I feel like that's a good way for us to wrap this conversation with such concrete and also very helpful advice for individuals who are in positions of any kind of managerial responsibility. You've given us so much to think about in terms of eudaimonic identity theory, intrinsic motivation, understand the huge effort and also possibility that comes with
Mhm.
this quest for self-realization and then putting that into
Mhm.
practice. I'm really grateful for your time today and
Mhm.
for helping us at least scratch the surface of this
Mhm.
extraordinary
Once
iceberg of
again,
possibility here.
very, very glad to provide it.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.